Okay, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Carl Letamendi. I am a quantitative research methodologist and research design coach for Nova Southeast University, which essentially means that I just help Nova students with anything related to quantitative research methodology, research design, survey design, data analysis, fun stuff like that, the statistics. So, before I begin, I have a confession to make. I didn't put together the content of this presentation. The presentation it comes directly from a guide from the John Creswell text on chapter 8, which is quantitative methods. So this is actually really meant to be like a supplement to what you are going to be reading in chapter 8 in the Creswell text. Designing quantitative methods research. So essentially, as I go through this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the slide, and then I'm also going to interject and talk a little bit about how I came up with my research topic and some of the implications and the things that were facilitated by quantitative methods research. So here we have the methods section of a quantitative research proposal follows our standard form as illustrated in the figure below. It includes information on the design of the study, including the specific type of experiment. So in a quantitative methods research, you have participants who you're going to be conducting your study on. You have materials. So if you have a survey, for example, that's considered part of the material as well. You have procedures, and then you also have measures, and this tends to be a little bit more towards the end for the data analysis part. So, for example, in my dissertation study, I had over 500 participants in my study because I know that for my particular type of study, it was in aggregate consumer sentiment. Um, the entities that produced the research that I found in my literature review always tended to have about 500 participants in any study that was done at minimum. For the materials, some of the materials that I used a survey instrument that I designed along with some other parts of other surveys that I found with permission of from those authors, of course. I had a couple steps that I needed in order to get my participants to take the study, and then eventually I used what's called SPSS, which is a statistical modeling and statistical analytics program used to interpret data. This is kind of like the flow that chapter 8 of the Creswell text follows. And outlining the steps, you have the purpose, identification of a population, you have the sample, and the sample is really just meant to be like a group of people who are going to be taking your study who are meant to be representative of a larger population. So for example, in my sample population, I had over 500 people who were representing over 48 states in the US, and this sample population was meant to be representative of a larger population. That line means larger in my lingo. The survey instrument, uh, like I said in the previous slide, the survey instrument that I used was a survey that I designed and had pieces of other surveys as well. You have relationship between variables, which is an approach that you can make if you're trying to draw what's called inferences on your data. And inferences is basically when you make an observation on the patterns of what's going on in the responses, and then you say, okay, well, based on these data, I can infer that, and then blank, you make a prediction or a professional judgment on what it is that you're seeing. The research questions in your study are going to drive your research. The specific items on the survey are, for example, things kind of like variables that you may use to draw these inferences. Steps are taking in the analysis after you collect all your data, and then you interpret data from your survey. So a lot of emphasis in quantitative methods research is kind of goes around the topic of surveys. So It's very easy to talk about quantitative methods research if we talk about surveys. And if you're ever going to conduct a research, I don't know how many of you are in a PhD or in a master's level program, but I know, for example, like I know some of you taking this class maybe in the CSA program in the field of student affairs, we talk a lot about assessment. And in assessment, you're always surveying your student population to see if they're satisfied with the services that are rendered, for example. A survey design provides a quantitative description of trends, attitudes, or opinions of a population by studying a sample. So if we are talking about student affairs, for example, if you survey a group of students, you're not going to survey every single student in your university. You're going to get a sample of the population, okay? Population sample. So then you're going to survey them to try to identify trends, attitudes, or opinions about whatever it is that you're trying to study. The researcher generalizes or draws inferences to the population based on the results obtained from the study sample. So then this is after you collect all of your data from the survey that you distribute, and then you start to tell the story about what happens. So this is one of the differentiations between qualitative versus quantitative data. And a lot of times it's unfortunate. You'll see that it kind of feels like as a researcher, you reach a fork in the road and you have to decide, am I going to use qualitative or am I going to use quantitative? And then you see some people label themselves as either a quant person or a qual person. And that saddens me a little bit, sad face, because I think that qualitative and quantitative research complement each other in a way. It's not that you have to be a quant person if you're going to get into like hard science type research, or anything like that. But like if you have, for example, like going back to the student affairs example, if you survey a sample population in a university setting, let's say that you're able to survey 150 students to try to find out how satisfied they are with your campus. These 150 students are supposed to be representative of your entire student body because you're not able to survey every single student at your university. It's not feasible to do so, or to imply or to think that you're gonna get that entire sample. So the quantitative part would be distributing the survey to these 150 students and getting their opinions, attitudes, or trends. Qualitative can complement this nicely because you can give these 150 students the opportunity to tell you a story about why they answered a certain way. And that's where qualitative methods research can really help quantitative research to try to tell a deeper story. So quantitative research, I feel like gives you the broad picture of what's happening, but qualitative research goes in deeper to explain a little bit more about what's happening by providing a narrative. And the narrative piece is really what quantitative methods research lacks, because since you're surveying so many people, it's really hard to get a narrative from them. Okay. In an experimental design, the basic intent is to test the impact of the treatment on an outcome controlling for all other factors. This may include random assignment of individuals to groups. It's 7:30. Survey method design components. The first part of the methods section can introduce readers to the basic purpose and rationale for the research. Identify the purpose of the survey research. So here again, we're talking about surveys because it's very easy to talk about that. You could also be doing a different type of um, quantitative research when you're looking at an existing data set. And since I know a lot of you are in the CSA program, I'm going to give you a CSA example. The iPad system from the Department of Education, for example, provides enrollment data on schools across the US. So in that situation, you're not really interviewing or surveying anybody. You're looking into an existing database to try to tell a story or to make conclusions about the research that you find, the data that you find. But here we're identifying the purpose of the survey research, and it's important whenever you're doing research to identify the purpose. You don't want to have purposeless research. The purpose is to generalize from sample to a population so that inferences can be made. And then again, this is one of the highlights of quantitative methods research is that You take a small sample of a larger population, and then based on the responses of the sample, you draw inferences on the data based on the information that they give you. Indicate why the survey is the preferred type of data collection procedure for the study. So if you're going to be doing any particular type of survey research, for example, you want to go into the literature and find other types of similar approaches that have been done. So, like for example, if again CSA example, if you're going to be doing a study to find how likely your students are to join a fraternity or a sorority, and you're looking into the higher ed research that's out there, and you find that, for example, the regression analysis is what's been used in the past. If you try to go out of if you try to do something that's way off, then it's going to be questioned and it's going to raise a red flag. So you kind of have to justify why you're using that particular type of study. If you want to use the same type of study that you find out there in the literature, then that's fine too, because the whole purpose of research is to contribute a little bit more to your field. Indicate whether the survey will be a cross-sectional or longitudinal, and specify the form of the data collection. So you want to explain how you're collecting your data. The population and the sample. Identify the population in the study, include the size of this population if the size can be determined. So for example, going back to mine, my population specifically was 335 people across the US who I did in my study. So then that was my sample population. Identify whether the sampling design for this population is single stage or multi-stage. Identify the selection process. Random sampling is ideal. Each individual in the population has an equal probability of being selected. And then this is also very important when you're doing research. So, like for example, if you're gonna be doing a study a survey to find out how, like, just to give you like a hypothetical off the wall example, if you're gonna be doing a study to try to find out how satisfied people are with a gym, for instance, and you want to have a diverse sample consisting of males and females, you're not going to stand inside of the men's locker room trying to get a sample because you're only going to get males, for instance. So you want to be able to position yourself, whether it's physically at a location soliciting a survey or however it is that you're going to do it. You want to make sure that you get a sample that's proportionate to your larger population. So, like for example, in my study, I was able to get 535 people. The criteria for these people to take my study is that they had to be 18 years of age and live in the US, and that's it. So you want to make sure that you can control randomization as much as you can and ensure that it's really purely random to make sure that there's no bias in the population. Each individual in the population has an equal probability of being selected. This provides the ability to generalize to the population. Population and sample. Identify whether the study will involve stratification of the population. In order to stratify, and characteristics of the population must be known. In stratification, specific characteristics are represented in the sample, and the sample reflects the true proportion in the population. So then this also falls along with weighting, for example. I know, again, I'm going to stick to the CSA example since I know some of you in this class are probably doing the CSA program. If you look into the NESI survey, for example, which is the National Assessment of Student Engagement, or the National Survey of Student Engagement, rather, they do what's called weighting. And not it's not waiting in line, it's waiting, like WEIGHT, waiting, and that basically means that they apply a statistical formula to try to ensure that there's a good balance between males and females, because whether you're looking at a population in a university setting or you're just distributing a survey period, most of your respondents are going to be women, and this is a phenomenon that happens no matter where you are. Women tend to take surveys more than men do, and it's a lot more disproportionate than you think. So like for example, the last time I looked back into the NESI, if we look at this whole as a sample population, only about 25%, which is a quarter, were males. So then what they do is they apply a statistical weight to make sure that it's like a 50-50 cut between the two. So they have to weigh the males' responses a little more than the females. And there's a lot of dispute about whether or not that's a good practice, even still. But they do that nonetheless to try to make sure that the population is proportionate to the percentage of students that are in a school, for instance. Discuss the procedures for selecting the sample from available lists. So this is another thing you want to highlight in quantitative methods research. You also have to discuss the procedures for selecting the sample and discuss your population thoroughly. Indicate the number of people in the sample and the procedures used to compute this number. Sample size relates to the analysis plan for study. Determine a margin of error you're willing to tolerate. Determine the confidence level for this margin of error. So this actually here gets a little bit more deep into what's called alpha levels, confidence levels, all you need to know for the social science research is that what's an acceptable confidence level is 95%, or what you have is a p-value less than 0.05. These two basically mean the same thing. You may also come across the term confidence interval, which is CI. This is more for terminology that's prevalent in epidemiology and other types of public health related research. They'll say, these data are statistically significant at the 95% confidence interval, and that's the language that they'll use. But basically, all they mean is it just means that you can be confident that the statistics are telling you an accurate story. Estimate the percentage of your sample that will respond in a given way. The steps will allow you to determine the sample size needed for each group. Instrumentation. Describe established validity of the instrument. Content validity. Did the items measure the content they were intended to measure? Construct validity. Do the items measure hypothetical constructs or concepts? And predictive or concurrent validity. Do scores predict a criterion measure or do results correlate with other results? So in my study, it was a little bit more predictive because I wanted to identify what other variables influence consumer sentiment. So I had to do more along the lines of a predictive study. Mention whether scores resulting from past use of the instrument demonstrate reliability. This will appear as internal consistency and retest. This is very important. You want to continually test and retest your data to make sure that it's consistent. When an instrument is modified, it becomes important to reestablish validity and reliability. So in quantitative methods research, for example, if you're studying the economy, you're not going to use the same measures that you used in the 1950s today because time changes, people change, society changes. So with quantitative methods research, it's never static and it's fluid, so it evolves, it's organic, and you have to reestablish validity and then test it again, test and retest, and then you want to make sure that it's still reliable. Include sample items from the instrument. Indicate the major content sections in the instrument. So like this is, for example, if you have a survey that has many different parts to it, but then there's like a larger part, larger headings with little subheadings as well. So like if you're doing a study to see how satisfied your students are in the campus setting, you like one category would probably be satisfaction with faculty and staff, satisfaction with campus resources, and then you have questions specific to that category, content sections. Discuss plans for pilot testing of field testing, the study, and provide rationale for these plans. So then rationale, you're constantly always making sure that you justify why it is that you're approaching your study the way you are. If you're using a mail survey, identify steps for administration. Discuss how you will obtain a good response rate. So generally, they say that a response rate is about 10% for surveys, so it's really low. It depends if you know your population, if they know who you are, if you don't use mail, because I don't remember the last time I got a survey in the mail, and unless it's from the Census Bureau, I'm throwing it away, and that's just the truth. Now we do things via email, or we do things, through electronic surveys, because it helps to facilitate the process for you as the researcher, and also for the person taking the survey. If it takes them too long to do, or if it's too complicated, the chances of them not taking it increase significantly. So you want to try to make sure that it's easy for them to take the survey. And these are all ways that you can help to ensure a good response rate. So, for example, I didn't use a survey via the mail, and that's one of the ways that I ensured a good response rate. Also, one of the things that I did for my study is I encouraged usage of what's called in marketing the 6 degrees of separation. And it's like this mathematical hypothesis that states that we are connected to every single person on this earth through 6 networks. So it's kind of like if you know someone else who knows someone else who knows someone else. When you get to that sixth person, you've already covered everyone on this planet. So it's a very interesting ideology, but I kind of use that same principle by encouraging my participants to distribute the survey to other people who are eligible to take the survey. And in return, what I offered, instead of money or a gift card, and I didn't have any of that stuff for my study, I simply said that if they were able to acquire a certain amount of participants for me, that I would list them in my acknowledgement sections, giving them special thanks. And for some reason, that had a lot of weight, and a lot of people were happy and motivated by that to share my study and ensure that other people in their states would take the survey. Data analysis and interpretation. Report information about the number of members of the sample who did and did not return the survey. Discuss the method by which response bias will be determined. Response bias is the effects of non-responses on survey estimates. So then it's really up to you whether or not you're going to include responses that were left blank. For me, I forced all my responses. And the way that you do that, if you're doing a survey online, for example, if you're using SurveyMonkey or Snap Surveys or whatever survey you want to use, there's a way to force responses so that if they click next, for example, it says this question requires a response. So then that way you get all the data that you need. And if somebody wasn't going to give you all the data to begin with, then it wasn't worth that person. It's not worth your time to even look at that person's data. Some people see it the other way. Some people like to use it. It really just depends on the type of study. If it's for a study like how mine was, I definitely needed to know everything. So I had 45 questions, and I needed to know everything in order to make the inferences that I made for my study. Discuss a plan to provide descriptive analysis of data for all independent and dependent variables. And dependent variable is dependent on the independent variable. So then it's actually kind of like the dependent variable is the outcome, and the independent variable are your predictors, for example. So if you're trying to determine what makes students happy on campus, for example, level of happiness is the dependent variable because that's the outcome. And then you're measuring that and you're predicting it based on the independent variables of your study. So maybe you predict that the number of scholarships that a student has a relationship with their satisfaction. So then this is saying that you hypothesize that the more scholarship a student gets on campus, the happier they will be as a student, just to give you an example. So then in that case, the independent variable is the number of scholarships. And you can have many independent variables. And there's some studies that have many dependent variables too. If the proposal contains an instrument with skills or plan to develop skills, identify a statistical procedure. So I skipped out on this, but when you're doing data analysis, you can use many different types of software. You can definitely use Excel. A lot of the survey platforms allow you to download your survey responses onto Excel. The more popular one that we use at Nova that we have installed in the Maltz computer lab is SPSS, which is the statistical package for the social science. You can use that as well. There's also more complicated ones like R, and with R, you're going to need a little bit more technical and computer programming skills. There's SQL, which is the structured query language. There's MATLAB, there's SAS, there's a whole bunch of stuff. But if you're not completely if you don't really know way too much about data analytical tools, Excel is a way to go as a starting point, and then you can move up to SPSS. And then as long as you have those two, you're good to go. Identify the statistics and the statistical computer program for testing the major inferential research questions or hypotheses, which I just mentioned. Present the results in tables or figures, and interpret the result from the statistical test. So in SPSS, for example, you can get a lot of tables, and basically what the tables are going to tell you is the relationship between two variables. At least that was the case in my study. And then if you have any figures, figures are like pie charts or bar charts, line charts, any other kind of chart. But if it's a table, it's a table. If it's not, it's a figure. And that's the easy way to remember it. And then you interpret the results from the statistical test. If you're working on a dissertation, this would actually be your chapter 4, your results section. Report how the results answer the research question or hypothesis. So now that you have at this point, you have all of your results, you've analyzed them, and you put them through your computer program, your statistical computer program. Now you're able to look in the research question that you generated and your hypotheses and see if the data that you now have satisfies that hypothesis. Were you correct or were you incorrect? It's okay to be incorrect or correct. That's the whole point of doing research, is for discovery. So you want to make sure whether or not you were right in your guess or not. Also report the effect size and the confidence interval. So remember how before I told you that it said confidence level, but in public health and epidemiology they use confidence interval. But all it just means is that there's a 95% chance that your data is good, and a 5% error. So then basically you just subtract the confidence interval by 100%, and then that's how you get the maximum error allowed for your study. And then discuss the implications of the results for practice or for future research. So once you have your data, you also want to be able to include some sort of conclusion that discusses how a future researcher can look at your study and make use of it, or how they can build onto it. So like if you're doing a study of your campus, for example, a future researcher can look at your method and they can apply it to a larger study, or they can just simply use your same approach and reference you in their campus if you don't have access to their students. But it's always good practice to discuss some of the challenges that you went through as you were doing the study and the implications of the data that you have, and also discuss future research. Experimental method plan. Participants. Describe the selection process for participants as either random or non-random. When individuals are non-randomly assigned, the procedure is called a quasi-experiment. So now here we're getting a little bit more into the type of research that's done in epidemiological studies, which is public health. When individuals can be randomly assigned to groups, the procedure is called a true experiment. Discuss how the individual will be randomly assigned to the treatment group. So then see here we get our first evidence of the fact that these are public health terminologies. Identify other features in experiment of design that will systematically control variables that might influence the outcome. For example, approaches that equates the group such as matching. Let the reader know about the number of participants in each group and the procedures for determining the size of each group. Many researchers use the power analysis to identify appropriate sample size. The following information is needed to calculate the sample size: the alpha level, the amount of power desired, and the effect size. So then this is really just making your sample size proportionate to the larger population that you're trying to make be represented by the smaller sample of your study. Variables. Clearly identify dependent variables in the experiment. One dependent variable must be the treatment variable. So this is more applicable in public health, and I'm going to keep saying that whenever I see these, because when you're dealing with the social sciences in our field here at SHSS, we're mostly going to deal with survey-based quantitative research or looking at an existing database. Um, you're not really going to have like a group of people that you're going to try to treat them to heal them of their ailments. It's not going to happen. Identify the dependent variable or variables. These can be thought of as outcome variables. See, dependent variable is the outcome variable, like I said. According to Rosenthal and Rosno, there are three outcomes to measure: the direction of the observed change, the amount of this change, and the ease with which the participant changes. So like, for example, um, for my particular study, one of the things that I realized is that the higher your likelihood, because I asked my participants, what is the likelihood in a percent chance that you will commit a crime if you had to provide for your family? So my participants had to provide a percentage from 0 to 100 and then provide a justification for why. So if you were looking at a line graph like this, for example, the direction can either go down, and then if we put here 0 to 100%, right? You can either go down and then so right here we have the reported percent chance, and then here let's say that we have income levels. So then basically if we have a line going upward, this means that the more money people make, the more likely they are to commit a crime. But actually what my study found was the opposite. The less money you have, or the less money that you have in discretionary income, the higher percent chance you report of willingness to commit a crime if you had to provide for your family. Except when participants said that they had family that they could turn to if they had a some sort of financial situation. So then here we look at direction of the change. It can either go up, it can go down, or it can have no relationship at all, which is just a flat line. The amount of this change is basically the increment up or the increment down, and the ease with which the participant changes. Identify the type of experimental design to be used in the proposed study. For example, pre-experimental design, quasi-experiments, experiments, and single subject designs. You're not going to have at least not in our field, social science. You're not going to have a um, single subject research. Identify what is being compared and experiment. When two or more groups are being compared, this is called a between subjects design. When only one group is being studied, this is called a within group design. So then one group within group, and then two or more groups between subjects. Provide a diagram or figure to illustrate the specific research design to be used. And this is another aspect of quantitative methods research. You're going to have a lot of diagrams, a lot of charts, a lot of figures to use to explain the data that you have. X represents an exposure of a group to an experimental variable or event. See, we have public health terminology. O represents the observation or measurement. The letter R indicates the random assignment. Left to right indicates the temporal order of procedures. This is all public health references. You have some threats to validity, which are called internal threats. History, which is events can occur that influence the outcome. So for example, for me, in my study, it was very time sensitive. So every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces what's called the Consumer Price Index, right? So this is every month. And when they present the consumer price index, like automatically there's volatility in the stock market. And then when people observe this volatility in the stock market, they react. So what I had to do was be very mindful of the fact that I had to get my results not here, not here, but I needed to get it here before the consumer price index went out because I needed to capture consumer sentiment before they were informed of what the state of the economy was. Maturation, participants in an experiment may mature or change. And that does hold true there in any kind of study that you do. There may be some things that the participant undergoes that causes them to change their perspectives or their opinions. Regression, scores over time regress towards the meaning. And then regress is a prefix to a Latin word which means to come back. So this is just coming back towards the average or towards the meaning. Selection, participants can be collected with certain characteristics that affect outcome. Mortality, participants dropped out during an experiment. They choose not to continue or they die. So these are all threats that you have when you're conducting any type of research. Particularly when it comes to mortality, if you're conducting a study over time, like a long period of time. Diffusion of treatment, communication between participants of the control and experimental groups can influence the outcome. Compensatory or resentful demoralization, benefits of an experiment may be unequal or resented with only the experimental group receives treatment. So then this is, again, public health terminology here. Compensatory rivalry, participants in a control group feel that they are being devalued because they are not receiving the treatment. And this is a lot of times it happens with clinical trials. For example, your control group, for example, is going to get the sugar pill. The experimental group is going to get the diabetes, the diabetes medication, and participants don't know which pill they're taking, and then they report their vitals and all this other stuff. So then that's why I said this is more like public health related. Testing, participants become familiar with the outcome measure and remember responses for later testing. Instrumentation, instrument changes between pre-test and post-test. If you are doing a pre-test and a post-test type of study, so this would be pre-test, post-test would be kind of like CSA example again. If you're identifying how students feel about their dean, for example, or how they feel about the president of the university. You get their responses in the pretest here, and then maybe you give them like a story about the president of the university, or you talk to them about their accomplishments, or you show them a video, and then you give them the same assessment again, and then see if they test differently or if they change their responses. The procedure. The writer describes in detail the procedure for conducting the experiment, and that holds true whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative research, which is something that if you're writing a dissertation, you would do in your chapter 3, which is your methodology. Discuss a step-by-step approach for the procedure in the experiment. The reader should be able to understand the design, observations, treatment, and timeline of the activities. Data analysis. Report the descriptive statistics calculated for observations and measures at the pretest or post-test stage.
It's 8 o'clock.
Descriptive statistics, basically like if you're distributing a survey and then you have a pie graph and then the pie graph is divided between certain ethnic groups, for example, right? This is the descriptive statistics because you're not really drawing inferences based on these data that you're picking out from your study. You're just explaining to the reader of your study what the breakdown of your population was like, maybe how they responded, and things like that. You're not really like comparing two variables or calculating the relationship between two variables. So the mean, which is the average, the standard deviation, and the range. So standard deviation, for those of you who aren't familiar, let's suppose we have a line graph here, and I'm just gonna, let's say that we have, for example, like a stock, right? And I know maybe you're not familiar with volatility and stock market, but I think you can still get a sense for it. So let's say that there's this stock and it goes up and down and up and down like this in this pattern, right? Okay. And then you have all these little markers here above and below. So suppose that the line that we just drew is actually the average movement. These little points out here are also data markers which show activity. The standard deviation is basically the distance between these outside markers and the mean. Okay, so then that's what standard deviation is. It's basically like I said, the distance between the average and this point on the outside as an average. So standard deviation, that's what that means. And it's basically a measure of volatility. The higher the standard deviation, the wider the variance between the mean and the outside marks. Indicate differential statistical tests used to examine the hypothesis in the study. For single subject designs, use line graphs for baseline and treatment observations. Again, public health example. Interpreting results. The final step in an experiment is to interpret the findings. Address whether the hypotheses are questions are supported or refuted. Consider whether the treatment actually made a difference for participants. Oh, what happened there? All right, so we were on that last slide anyway, so let's just go here. Consider whether the treatment actually made a difference for participants who experienced them. Suggest why or why not the results were significant. Address whether the results might have occurred because of inadequate experimental procedures. Indicate the implications of the results. It's also good practice if you do a quantitative methods research, just to kind of like have a reflective piece towards the end and explain. Like here how it says implications, for example. So when you're doing research design, you're very hyped up about a way that you're going to approach a research question, for example, but that might not have been the best way to go. And you might realize this like after having done 80% of the study, but you can't go back and do that all over again. You have to roll with it. So also discussing like what other people can do differently, or maybe what you can do differently as a researcher in the future might also help. So essentially, the quantitative and qualitative research methods are two different ways of approaching any kind of research that you want to do. As I said in the opening of the presentation, um, a lot of times people will self-identify as a quant person or a qual person, and that's kind of like the direction that research has gone in, into self-identifying with a label of what your preferred research style is. But I think they really complement each other, and we need each other. Qualitative and quantitative people both need each other for research, because quantitative people they bring the story, and qualitative folks tell the story. And this concludes the presentation on some of the highlights for quantitative methods research from the Creswell text, chapter 8. If you have any questions about this presentation, or if you want to confirm certain things, you can always feel free to email me. My email address, I don't have it written here, but I'll put it in. It's LETAMEND, so my last name without the I, at nova.edu. I know, for example, some of you who are in the CSA program might want to apply for like a NASPA or like an ACPA grant or something like that. And there is a quantitative, sometimes a quantitative research part to it. I'm more than happy to help you all with that part of any application that you fill out. Again, my email, LETAMEND at nova.edu. Thanks for watching.